Chapter 5 of Seminar 20 is titled The Other Satisfaction. Me, personally, I think the editor could have done a better job and subtitled it instead, Not Living Up To. To what? What are we not living up to? This other satisfaction, of course, which raises two preliminary questions if you've read this chapter, just to get us started on it. First, what is this other satisfaction to which we fail to live up? Second, on what type of jouissance does this other satisfaction, as well as our failure to live up to it, depend? Two questions to get us going. Now, at the start of Chapter 5, where Lacan is queuing all of this up, he begins with an ambiguous nod to language, which is our first clue as to how to answer these questions. The other satisfaction and the enjoyment that conditions and attends our failure to live up to it are, according to Lacan, based on language. And that's all it gives us to start. It's on page 51. You can check it out. The big hint here is it's based on language. Thanks, Jacques. Now, in all gratitude, though, another clue arrives 2 pages later, and this one we can make use of, where Lacan returns to this other satisfaction. It's on page 53 if you've got the text in front of you, and if you don't, I'm happy, as ever, to read it for you. Page 53, on the other satisfaction we're trying to figure out here. The other satisfaction I was talking about earlier, Lacan says, referring to his opening riff in this chapter, is exactly the satisfaction that can be seen to emerge from what? Well, my good friends, there's no escaping it if you force yourself to look at it closely. From universals, the good, truth, and beauty. So let's take this one step at a time. What type of language use is the basis for this other satisfaction and the jouissance that conditions and attends our failure to live up to it? Why, it's the type of language use that results in the formation of universals, like truth with a capital T, beauty with a capital B, the good with a capital G. And we could just keep adding to this list: freedom, equality, honesty, integrity, respect, blah, 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 and all with capital first letters. And don't forget about the 2 universals we've been discussing in this series: autonomy as oneness with oneself, love as oneness with another. With this additional term, oneness, things start to become clear. All the universals that Lacan has in mind and the experiences of satisfaction they promise are oneifications. Remember what Lacan has been saying, or at least suggesting for years, most piercingly since Seminar 14. Universals and universes alike are always verbs turned nouns. They are products or effects of a certain type of language use in which multiplicity gives way to singularity, the many to the one. Like the universe, which is no such thing, that we talked about last time, these universals that Lacan is flagging here in Chapter 5, they all function as oneifications. Hence the etymology that I've been harping on for a while now. In Latin, universus, the origin of universal and universe, means all together, all in one, whole, entire, and the like. It's from the Latin unus, meaning one, and vertere, meaning to turn, to convert, to transform, to actively change. So there it is. Simple math. Unus plus versus equals oneification. It's something you do, not something you find. So what exactly is this other satisfaction to which we're not living up? It's that of the one, of oneness, in the sense of completion, consistency, wholeness, and plenitude, and all, baby, still to come. And all, once more, because there is such a thing as language use. Thanks to language, we are speaking beings goaded by universals. Flowers of rhetoric, these universals, that prove once more that we are, just as my man Kenneth Burke put it decades ago, rotten with perfection. Like everything else, in our socio-discursive realities, there are no other. These universals, truth, beauty, the good, the one, and so on, they're etched into us. To be a speaking being is to be inscribed with universals to which we fail to live up. Universals whose other satisfaction always remains just that: other, distant, remote, foreign. Now, holler at all the Kantians out there. You might call these universals ideas. They don't exist, but they're certainly conceivable. Conceivable enough to provide us with maxims for right living. In a very real sense, the stake in Chapter 5 of Seminar 20 is morality. I, however, although I'm certainly a Kantian like the rest, or at least I try to be, that's the thing about the Kantians, they're always trying. I, however, am more of a Lacanian than a Kantian, as you may have guessed, and as such, I prefer Lacan's choice of term instead. Universals in the Lacanian terminology that we know, they are called ego ideals. Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, with a capital P, J, F, and T if you're pagan. And what about faith, hope, and charity for all the Christians out there? These are all ego ideals. They are signifiers doubling as ideals that we have introjected, brought inside ourselves, and that we now allow to govern our positions in society. To say nothing of how we feel towards others and ourselves. Hear me now. All of these ego ideals are universals that promise a certain kind of satisfaction, if only we could live up to them. There are lots of words for this promised yet ever-distant satisfaction, but they all amount to a single term, and it is the term of the singular that we've been talking about for so long now: oneness. Oneness with self, oneness with others, oneness with the gods, the ancients, and so on. The list, again, goes on. And we don't need to add to it here. Simply put, as split subjects, multitudes through and through, just as Granddaddy Whitman realized, oneness is foreign to us, and thus fantastical as well, right up there with all those universals. Which is why we never stop talking, writing, texting, posting, dreaming, and fantasizing about all this shit. And of course, check it out, censoring, punishing, hurting ourselves for not living up to all this shit. Make no mistake, with the ego ideal comes an ego that fails to achieve it, and a superego that never lets them forget it. Does this mean, am I here telling you that the enjoyment that conditions and attends our failure to live up to these universals is perverse, sadomasochistic in particular? Yeah, sometimes. But this isn't where Lacan goes from here in Chapter 5, as you may have noticed. It's not our fault, he says, that we're not living up to the other satisfactions promised by these universals. Instead, it's our jouissance that is to blame. It's our jouissance that routinely comes up short, proving inadequate and letting us down. And what kind of jouissance does Lacan have in mind here? Why, dear friends, phallic jouissance, of course. Page 55 gives us some good clues on this. You heard me right, motherfuckers, he says. Now, the motherfucker part isn't in there, but it might as well be. He says, you heard me right. Failing, deficiency, something that isn't working out, something skids off the track in what is manifestly aimed at, and then it immediately starts up with the good and happiness. The good, the bad, and the oafish. Jouissance shows that in itself it is deficient. For in order for it to be that way, something about it mustn't be working. How do we know it's phallic jouissance, phallic enjoyment, that proves itself deficient, failing, preventing us from living up to ego ideals of every stripe, but only ever colored one? Because it's the only type of jouissance that exists. And I mean that technically. Existent jouissance can only ever be phallic jouissance. And phallic jouissance, as we well know, never ceases to let us down. And again, all on account of language. So, masculine subjects, feminine subjects, none elude the phallic function, as we know. And none achieve the type of oneness that the phallic function promises. At which point, all of us masculine and feminine subjects, myself and yourself included, we just start up again with those damned universals, just as Lacan notes here. Lo, the good, the bad, and the oafish. From one failed dream of oneness to the next, we never quite manage to awaken from the phallic function. Which brings us to my favorite passage in Chapter 5. It's not my favorite passage in Seminar 20 so far, but I love this bit at the top of page 56 in Chapter 5. This part about never quite awakening from the phallic function, check this out. We never manage to wake up. When something happens in our dreams that threatens to cross over into the real, it distresses us so much that we immediately awaken. In other words, we go on dreaming. You heard right, and you gotta love this line of thought. Reality, that discursive reality, and there is no other, this is also among our vaunted universals. One more flower of rhetoric, as Lacan puts it in this chapter, to be sniffed and seen, but only ever with eyes wide shut, if you ask me. How about that happiness you just heard about? Happiness fits in here too. Happiness, this one's a biggie, especially when you march it back to Aristotle, for whom the magic moral word was eudaimonism. Well-behaved subjects seldom make history, as you may have heard, but damn if Aristotle didn't make us think these motherfuckers were on the path to happiness with a capital H. Now, Lacan doesn't make much of this in Chapter 5, despite numerous references to Aristotle, his ethics, and eudaimonism. In fact, he uses his most pronounced reference to eudaimonism as a springboard into something even squirrelier. a squirrelier discussion of what he calls utilitarianism. And I say what he calls utilitarianism because damn if he's got a wild sense of utilitarianism. And this, as you might guess, is where things get interesting. From Aristotle and eudaimonism to Bentham and utilitarianism, the fun starts at about page 58. What, Lacan asks, is utilitarianism? Well, flip to page 58. Let's see how he puts it. You're going to love this. Utilitarianism means nothing but the following. We must think about the purpose served by old words, those that already serve us, nothing more. We must not be surprised by what results when we use them. Boom, there you go. That's all it amounts to. Thanks, Bentham. We don't need you. We've got Lacan explaining to us what utilitarianism means. What he tells us here, I joke, but it's actually quite good, is that utilitarianism is about old words and their long service. A service so long that these words have become full of uses, aka useful. And not just full of uses, but full of surprises as well. What else are we doing when we run those lexical histories, when I push us into the realm of etymology? But discovering that words have histories, that they're full of utilities, some of which we've long forgotten, lots of which show up as surprises. Let's be clear about this. The unconscious may be structured like a language, as you've heard Lacan say, but don't forget what we've added to that. Language also has its own unconscious, and the discourse for the unconscious of language is called etymology, and that's why we're always digging into word history here. Why? Because we're just good utilitarians. Hello? Let's get serious, though. Utilitarianism is a big fancy word. Lacan says it's fundamentally, though, about the utility of old words, the purpose this utility serves, and one purpose more than any other. I just want to cut right to the chase here. The purpose that old words serve more than any other, Lacan suggests in Chapter 5, is to allow for a necessary enjoyment. Or more literally in Lacan's French, and I think the French here matters tremendously, the enjoyment that is needed. The purpose or the utility of old words is to allow for enjoyment that is needed, an enjoyment that is necessary. From il faut in the French, meaning it is necessary. It's on page 58. The French is there too. You can check it out. It is necessary as in one must, from the French verb falloir. Now, this third person singular, and sorry to dive into the weirdness of this, but Bruce sure as hell invites it, and I don't think he has it quite right. So let's see what we can make of this. The third person singular construction you just heard, il faut, also points to an ambiguity or equivocation in the use of this expression. Lacan is hot on this on pages 58 to 59. Bruce is hot on this in his translator's footnotes. We better damn well heat up on this as well. Faut in French is also the third person singular of the verb faillir, meaning to fail, to falter, to come up short, and that's the key part. Faillir means to almost accomplish something, but ultimately to fail to make it happen. I almost made it here on time. In the French term faut, and you know what, man, I don't know French. What am I talking about here? But my eyes can tell you how to spell it, F-A-U-T. In this French faut, we thus have two uses, two utilities, dear utilitarians. La jouissance qu'il faut. That's the French phrase that Lacan starts kicking this off with. What it means is this. There is a necessary enjoyment, an enjoyment that cannot not be. It also, however, means that there is an enjoyment that comes up short. This is an enjoyment that is necessary and that necessarily fails, letting us down. It has to be, and it has to fail. Let's be categorical here. Why the fuck not? Language use necessitates a certain kind of enjoyment that's always letting us down, coming up short, failing to satisfy. And now you can see the difference between my reading of Lacan's French and Bruce's. This is not how Bruce is translating this particular passage. And I think we're better served to ignore his and use this one instead. In this instance, I think it makes a lot more sense. Things are just fucking clearer when we stick with the path of necessity here. It's fundamentally about necessary enjoyment, enjoyment that cannot not be, that must be. Must be relative to what? Must fail relative to what? Relative to all the universals we've been discussing, in all their fantastical oneness, truth, beauty, the good, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, faith, hope, charity, happiness, equality, honesty, respect, and the granddaddies of them all, autonomy, freedom for oneself, and love, fusion with another, the two that we've been discussing in this series so far. Is there such a thing that succeeds, fulfills, satisfies, and does not come short when we get into these universals? Could there be a jouissance that doesn't come up short relative to the universals we've been discussing in all of their fantastical oneness? No. Jouissance of this sort is impossible. Jouissance that never fails, falters, or comes up short is impossible. There's no such thing as a jouissance that lives up to the other satisfaction of the oneness we can't stop dreaming about. Again, let's be categorical. With necessary enjoyment and its unavoidable failures comes the impossibility of an enjoyment that consistently satisfies, allowing us to live up to this other satisfaction with which Chapter 5 begins. And this, my friends, is where things don't just get interesting, but also highly technical, so hang on to your hats. Implicit in the enjoyment that must be and must fail is another enjoyment whose existence is impossible. Another enjoyment that cannot be and cannot fail to be otherwise. It's an impossible enjoyment that has always already succeeded in remaining just that, impossible. Like I said, hang on to your hats. I hope this becomes clear in a few minutes. But in the meantime, hang on to your fucking hats. Note the shift here between necessary enjoyment and impossible enjoyment. Note how these things are stacking up. Let me be very clear about this. Necessary enjoyment always fails relative to the non-existent universals that it is not. It always fails to live up to the universals and the oneness that they promise, and letting us down along the way. Impossible enjoyment, however, always succeeds relative to its own non-existence, to the non-being that it is. This is key to understanding what Lacan is doing here. As he tries to approach, we can just lay some cards on the table, feminine enjoyment. He's really working hard, thinking modally, thinking conditionally, how to speak about this part of feminine enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function. And he's using necessity and impossibility to start working this shit out. Right from the gates, though, we got to make sure we understand the difference here. Necessary enjoyment, and I'll clarify that more in a minute, is that which always fails relative to non-existent universals that it is not. Now, I say non-existent because equality doesn't fucking exist. Freedom doesn't exist. Autonomy doesn't exist. Narcissistic love, that shit don't exist either. Aristophanic love, come on, man, that doesn't exist. And yet we still wager on them. We wager on non-existence. We long to live up to these non-existent things. But guess what? You and me are existent beings. For us to pass over into the field of non-existence, into the universals, well, let's just say that's why heaven awaits. The key part here, though, is that necessary enjoyment always fails to live up to these universals. Universals that it, because it is necessarily existent, can never reach. However, if necessary enjoyment always fails, impossible enjoyment always succeeds. Why? Because it clings close to its own non-existence, to the non-being that it is, qua impossible. Like I said, it's crunchy stuff. Let's get back, though, to that other satisfaction with which Lacan begins chapter 5. This other satisfaction of the universal that I've been harping on here. This universal that necessary enjoyment seeks and ever fails to find. This other satisfaction of the universal that necessary enjoyment seeks and ever fails to find is simply not the standard or ideal on which impossible enjoyment stakes its success. Rather than try to become what it cannot, impossible enjoyment is content to be what it is, or more technically, what it ain't. And that's one we're going to have to unpack, so put a pin in that. In place of an other satisfaction, which is no such thing, impossible enjoyment finds self-satisfaction in its own non-existence. Hear me now. Necessary enjoyment always promises to make multiples into one. Hence Lacan's emphasis throughout this chapter and elsewhere on the universal. But impossible enjoyment doesn't take this route. Impossible enjoyment doesn't want multiples to become anything other than themselves. That's the key difference here. Let me be even more pointed. In impossible enjoyment, nothing is worse than wanting to be what you're not. Or more impossible, for that matter, like Plato's number 3 that would rather suffer anything than to avoid becoming even. Impossible enjoyment would suffer its own destruction before becoming a necessary one. What then, in all of this, is the precise logical relation between necessary and impossible enjoyment? Lacan begs this question. Let's see if we can answer it. It's simple in some sense. The former presupposes the latter. Necessary enjoyment presupposes impossible enjoyment. It's no more complicated than that. Which is why and how Lacan derives la jouissance qu'il ne faut pas from la jouissance qu'il faut. It's on page 58 to 59. The French is there. You check it out, run your translation app, see what you come up with. Check it out on your own. This is something we definitely want to discuss in our next Friday get-together. This passage is so wild, but this is the French that he's messing with here. And again, it's a passage that I don't think Bruce gets quite right in his translation, so it's important for you to dial in on this passage yourself. And that's why I keep harping on the French here. Now, granted, my harp is an Aeolian harp. Wherefore my bowels shall sound like an Aeolian harp. But it's still a harp, and one worth strumming on. I think in all of this, though, a theme that has been emerging for a while now in Lacan's thought is writing. And writing seems to be top of mind to him here as well. He thinks he can clarify what he's doing with necessary and impossible enjoyment by returning to the theme of writing. And again, this is one of those where I'm like, yo, hang on to your hats, but it kind of makes sense. Here's how he does this. To help folks understand what he's up to, he depicts necessary enjoyment as that which doesn't ever stop being written, or, depending on the translation, writing itself. It's that which doesn't ever stop writing itself. That's what necessary enjoyment is up to. Because it is necessary, and thus cannot not be, it's always showing up. When speaking beings get together, it can't stop showing up, this necessary enjoyment. So how about its presupposed correlate, impossible enjoyment? Impossible enjoyment, Lacan tells us, is that which never stops not being written. It never stops not writing itself. If necessary enjoyment never stops showing up when we're together, impossible enjoyment never starts showing up, no matter how hard we try. And think about this just in terms of human togetherness. Necessary enjoyment always attends the party. Impossible enjoyment doesn't even make an appearance. So let's see if we can start summing a bit of this up. It's squirrely stuff, as I mentioned, and all because, of course, we're just talking about utilitarianism here. Let's try and put some captions to this. In the realm of language use, discourse formations, and human togetherness, the satisfactions we seek, oneness with oneself, oneness with another, never materialize. They remain just as Lacan describes them in Chapter 5 of Seminar 20. Other satisfactions, ulterior satisfactions, remote satisfactions, satisfactions our necessary enjoyments never quite live up to. Now, with these captions, I think we can at last say what you probably already know, namely what each modality of enjoyment is in Lacanian theory and technique. No sense beating around this bush. The kind of enjoyment necessitated by language, which is always coming up short and leaving us unfulfilled, is, and the winner goes to phallic enjoyment. You knew this, didn't you? You already knew. Necessary enjoyment, as described in Chapter 5, is phallic enjoyment. And what about impossible enjoyment? The kind of enjoyment whose impossibility phallic enjoyment presupposes. That, my friends, is feminine enjoyment. But beware, I'm not talking about the part of feminine jouissance that shows up in the field of the symbolic, with all of its socio-discursive formations, as a partial object for someone else's desire. That ain't the part of feminine enjoyment we're talking about here. Instead, we're talking about the part of feminine enjoyment that only ever exists there, insisting there in the realm of phallic enjoyment, but ever from without, from the outside, from a realm of non-being, which is to say, ding, 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 winner, winner, chicken dinner, the real. We'll come back to all this in a minute, so just hang tight. For now, though, just focus on the key word, which is presupposes. I asked about the logical relationship between necessary and impossible enjoyment, phallic enjoyment, and its feminine correlate. The key word here is presupposes. Phallic enjoyment presupposes its feminine counterpart. Necessary enjoyment presupposes its impossible counterpart. Necessary enjoyment and impossible enjoyment are linked by presupposition. So also with phallic enjoyment, which presupposes the non-existence of any other kind of enjoyment, of any mode of enjoyment that's not wholly phallic, You see? You see how we start ramping up to the part of feminine enjoyment that is not wholly contained and included in the phallic field? Phallic enjoyment presupposes the non-existence and thus the impossibility of any other kind of enjoyment, that is not wholly phallic, that is not whole relative to the phallic function. You see? This is how it's starting to stack up. Jouissance beyond the phallic function is always, as Lacan calls it in Seminar 19, jouissabsence. That's his point. That's the point he's making, is that shit is always excised and absented relative to the field in which it nevertheless insists, on which it insists. But here we are, not in Seminar 19, but instead in Chapter 5 of Seminar 20. Lacan doubles down on this presuppositional logic that we've been discussing. The impossible aspect of feminine enjoyment, he says, is the substantial aspect, indeed the essential aspect, if you read the French carefully, of the phallic function. And look, I know this is weird stuff. Don't make this more complicated, though, than it needs to be. Lacan's argument here, again, is just simply a modal argument. If something is necessary, it cannot be otherwise. To be otherwise is impossible if something is necessary. For example, embodiment is a necessary part of human being. You have to have a body in order to be human. It's impossible to be human without one. Now, your body doesn't have to look like mine, and mine doesn't have to look like yours. You don't have to have arms or legs, but by God, you got to have a body in order to be human. It's impossible to be human without one. So also with death. To be human is to have a body that must perish. Death is a necessary, and for this reason, essential part of each and every human life. And if you just want to round out this unholy trinity that you've probably heard me round out before, just add the great psychoanalytic object of inquiry, care from others. Add care from others to embodiment and death, and you've got all the basic truths, necessary truths of human being, as I've often defined them. Embodiment, care from others, and death. Let me be clear about all this. If you have to have a body, it's impossible to be human without one. If your body has to receive care from others in order to survive, it's impossible to survive without this care from others. And if this body must perish, then immortality, I'm sorry to report, is also impossible. Necessity and impossibility are inseparable in this way. No field or function of impossibility, no conception or experience of necessity, and vice versa. No other enjoyment, no phallic enjoyment. No phallic enjoyment, no other enjoyment. They are reciprocally constitutive. Now, zoom out for a second and take a look. Take a listen to what you just heard. Notice all the if-then statements you just heard me rattle out. This is also how Lacan is thinking in Chapter 5 of Seminar 20. His line of inquiry isn't just modal, it's conditional. To speak and write about impossible jouissance, about another jouissance beyond the phallic function, is to speak and write in the conditional tense, Lacan tells us. The key page here is one of the two pages that we have, again, been harping on, page 59. There's great stuff in here on 58, 59. Holy shit, these pages are wild. But 59 is where he makes this turn out of the modal and into the conditional. Notice how he ramps up to this. Let me now return to the textual level, he says on page 59. It is the jouissance that shouldn't be, could never fail, and Bruce includes the French here that we've been toying with. I think that's important, again, because that's not how I would translate the French that follows. So I'm glad Bruce has it here so you can dig in the French and see what you think. Let me now return to the textual level. It is the jouissance that shouldn't be, could never fail. He's talking about impossible jouissance, the jouissance that cannot be and cannot fail. In the conditional tense. That suggests to me that to use it, we could employ protasis and apodosis. Look at him. Isn't he fancy? He got his Greek terms there. He's talking about if-then logics. If this, then that. I don't know why he's got to be all fancy in Greek with this shit. It's if-then thinking that he's working up. That's also what he means by material implication. You can look this up in your philosophy dictionary or whatever the fuck you use, and you'll see material implication. It's fundamentally about if-then statements. That's what he's messing around with here. The way he's beginning to access the part of feminine enjoyment that is not wholly squared away in the field of the phallus is by way of an if-then statement, the tense of which is conditional. If this, then that. I'm not saying this is. I'm saying if this, then that. That is a conditional statement, and it's what he's digging into here. Check it out. If it weren't for that, things would go better. That's a conditional tense in the second part. That is the material implication. There's that word, that phrase. It's technical. It means if-then in terms of logic. That is the material implication. The implication the Stoics realized was perhaps what was most solid in logic. How are we thus going to express what shouldn't be, could never fail, in other words, what cannot be and always succeeds, with respect to jouissance, if not by the following? Here's the key phrase. Were there another jouissance than phallic jouissance? It shouldn't be, could never fail to be that one. And again, work with the French here. If there were another jouissance beyond the phallic function, it could not be, it could never fail to be that one. Why? Why, if there were an impossible jouissance beyond the necessary jouissance sustained by the phallic function, would this impossible jouissance never fail to be the one, namely, that impossible one? Because if it were ever to enter into existence and thus become actual instead of impossible, it would also at the same time become phallic and thus something else entirely. It would no longer be impossible. No longer the jouissance that cannot be and never fails, it would become the jouissance that has to be and always fails, namely phallic jouissance. Remember, 3 would suffer anything than become even. And again, recall the key distinctions that are at stake here. Let's see if we can turn this screw one more time in ways that will finally cause things to link up. Phallic enjoyment always fails because it cannot cease to exist, but bases its success on the non-existent, namely on ideas, universals, oneifications that are not, that do not exist, and thus remain ever beyond the reach of all who do. Phallic enjoyment always lets us down because it pins our supposed satisfaction to ego ideals that we can't help but fail to live up to. Autonomy, freedom, self-sufficiency. Recall those lists that we've been toying with. Now let us consider its presuppositional correlate. Feminine enjoyment, We don't have to call it impossible enjoyment anymore. We can just call it feminine enjoyment. Beyond that which is governed by the phallic function, it always succeeds. Why? Because it's not based on universals, which it is not, but simply on its own non-existence, you've heard me say, namely on its own impossibility. And in this sense, it can't help but succeed in being and remaining itself. Another page for you to consider in support of this. It's the very next one, picking up from the one we just read. It's on page 60. It's a longer one. Close your eyes. Listen, it's got good stuff in here. He's responding to his sentence that says, were there another jouissance than phallic jouissance, it shouldn't be, could never fail to be that one, which is to say itself, impossible, and the like. And then notice how he recoups. That's very nice. One must use things like that, old words, as stupid as anything, but really use them. Work them to the bone. That's utilitarianism. So I just love how this is flowing. This is fantastic to me. Ostensibly, he's still just talking about utilitarianism. Now you can go to your, again, philosophical dictionary and look up utilitarianism. Read that entry and then go back and read this chapter and see how you can connect those dots. Here he says, that's just utilitarianism for you. That's what we're fucking with here. But notice how serious he then gets. And that utilitarianism allowed a giant step to be taken away from the old tales about universals that had preoccupied people since Plato and Aristotle, had dragged along throughout the Middle Ages, and were still suffocating Leibniz to so great an extent that one wonders how he still managed to be so intelligent. Were there another one? It shouldn't be, could never fail to be that one. What does that one designate? Does it designate the other in the sentence, or the one on the basis of which we designated that other as other? What I'm saying here is sustained at the level of material implication. There's that term again. Because the first part designates something false. Were there one, but there is no other than phallic jouissance, except the one concerning which woman doesn't breathe a word, perhaps because she doesn't know it. The one that makes her not whole. It is false that there is another one, but that doesn't stop what follows from being true, namely, that it shouldn't be, could never fail to be that one. Terrific passage. If your pen didn't hit the page when you read it the first time through, let this be a request to put your pen to page right here on page 60 of Seminar 20. Truth, falsity, we now pass from modality to the conditional to material implication, and now we're talking about truth and falsity again? Good Lord. Why is it false that there is another jouissance beyond the phallic function? You already know the answer. Because if there were another jouissance in existence, it wouldn't be an other jouissance, but instead another instance of phallic enjoyment. The only enjoyment which exists, which is phallic enjoyment, which means by implication that any enjoyment that's not phallic enjoyment cannot exist, and thus does not fail in the project of non-existence. And this, my friends, is not false. This, in fact, is a true statement. This is tricky stuff, no doubt. And I give myself an annual quota to use words like existence, and I think I've already exceeded that quota in just this single lecture, so apologies for that. In the midst of all this tricky shit, we got to be using technical philosophical terms. We're following Lacan's lead. These are terms he's also queuing up, but it is tricky stuff, no doubt. It's tricky logical stuff. And Lacan's point at this stage in his thought is, if you just read logic, all of this would make sense. You would completely understand what he's up to. Technically speaking, if you do a little work in symbolic logic, Lacan is not blowing any minds here. In fact, what's mind-blowing is how sometimes he just completely warps and fucks up basic tenets of logic, which, for Lacanians, is great. But nevertheless, this is tricky logical stuff that he's asking us to get into, and he is not a logician. Just as when he dips into mathematics, you have to remember, Lacan is not a mathematician. He may have hung with some mathematicians, had them out to the country house for the weekend to teach old Jacques some new tricks with the numbers, but he ain't a mathematician, and he sure as fuck ain't a logician either. This is tricky stuff, and he knows it. So let me try and be clear, hitting this nail one more time. There does not and cannot exist another jouissance beyond phallic jouissance, period. To claim otherwise is false. But if there were another jouissance beyond phallic jouissance, it couldn't fail to be just that, another jouissance beyond phallic jouissance, that as a direct result does not and cannot exist, and does not and cannot fail in this endeavor. This, dear Lacanians, is truth. So let's just stick with this truth. Now, these truths are lowercase t, but let's stick with it for a second. Lacan invites us to, so let's just go, let's do it. Take him at his word. What's the truth of feminine jouissance beyond the phallic function? You want to know? You want to know what the truth of feminine enjoyment in excess of the phallus is? It's exactly as Lacan puts it on page 60. It's an impossible truth deduced by material implication from what can only ever be false. It is false that there is another jouissance, but from this falseness we can deduce and derive truth. In this case, the truth of the part of feminine enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function. Now, what I just said may not be clear, it may not be accessible, but I'll be damned if it isn't coherent. Even so, I don't want you to get hung up with all this true-false business. Lacan, again, is just thinking in the conditional tense here, in an effort to address a mode of enjoyment that does not and cannot exist, except as an impossibility, established and sustained as such by a certain field of necessity. And truth be told, we've seen all this shit before. He was all over this in Seminar 19, too, trying to iron out his modalities. Here it is again. This field of necessity you just heard me mention is the one we've been discussing since the start of this series on Seminar 20, and even further back than that. It's the field of phallic enjoyment. The field of necessity here is the field of phallic enjoyment. And the impossible mode of enjoyment produced by this necessity, this necessary field of enjoyment, of phallic enjoyment, is that of, you guessed it, feminine enjoyment. And again, not the part of feminine enjoyment that lends itself to the phallic function as an object of desire for another in search of oneness. But again, we're talking about the part of feminine enjoyment that exceeds this function, extending beyond the necessary field of phallic enjoyment, and yet without ever negating it. Now that's a part that oftentimes gets left out, but it's a really important part. The part of feminine enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function does so without negating the phallic function. That's the fundamental difference between Lacan's formulas for masculine and feminine enjoyment relative to these biggies. The matheme, or the formula that says there exists someone, at least one, whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, the one that gave us the mythical father of the primal horde that we spent so much time discussing in recent series? Notice, that fantastical enjoyment of that one exceptional, real man comes at the expense of the phallic function. His enjoyment negates the phallic function. He don't have to play by those rules. Not so when it comes to feminine enjoyment. Feminine enjoyment also has an excessive characteristic. It also exceeds the phallic function, but only ever partially. And as such, feminine enjoyment, when it reaches beyond the phallic function, does so without negating it. Remember, it's as simple as this. Masculine enjoyment is an either-or. You're either 100% governed by the phallic function or 0% governed by the phallic function. But in the field of femininity, by which I mean subjectivized as feminine, you're always 1 to 99% governed by the phallic function, somewhere in that range. It ain't 0 and it ain't 100. Daddy's a 0. His sons are 100. The feminine subject exists in between, in an area that is not characterized by an either-or, but by a both-and. The and that extends her enjoyment beyond the phallic function does so without canceling her foot being in the phallic function at the same time. And that's what the two formulas of feminine subjectivity show. Now, at this point, given what you've heard from me in the past, 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 series, at this point you know why phallic enjoyment is necessary. It's because we're speaking beings, divided beings, heteronymous beings. We live and die by the signifier, baby. And one signifier above all the others, the phallus. Fundamentally, the phallic function is about language use, just as Lacan told us at the start of Chapter 5, here in Seminar 20. This is also why it always comes up short, because it stakes our would-be satisfaction on universals that don't exist, universals that are signifiers that don't exist and remain ever beyond our reach. Do you know why feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function is impossible? I think you do. It's because the phallic function is all we speaking beings know. It's not all we can experience, but it's all that can pass into existence as mediated by the signifier, read the phallus, and thus be known. And why does this part of feminine enjoyment succeed while phallic enjoyment fails? Because it is not premised on any universals. In other words, it's not trying to be what it's not. It doesn't ask this of others who experience it either. If phallic enjoyment is founded on one-ifying fantasies of being, according to which it is what it is, this aspect of feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic field is premised on multiplicities of non-being, the axiom of which isn't it is what it is, but instead it ain't what it ain't. Feminine enjoyment is not what it's not, and it's content with this. Were there such a thing as enjoyment of this sort beyond the phallic function, it could only ever be just that, beyond the phallic function, because beyond the field of language, and thus beyond the field of existence. In other words, nothing but its own impossibility. Now, at this point, we do have to address a rumor. You may have heard that there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. Have you heard that? I've heard that. I think it's a rumor. I don't know if it's true, but there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. Here, what we are arriving at is a correlate in the realm of jouissance. There is no such thing as jouissance beyond the phallic function. That shit is impossible. Indeed, that's exactly what it is, and nothing else. Impossible.